Hello, my name is David Bruce. The way that sound reverberates around different spaces can have a huge effect on the music that's played in them. In large spaces like concert halls, the sound travelling from the performer will travel to a greater or lesser extent in all directions and bounce off whatever it comes into contact with. Some things like wood and material will absorb much of the sound, where others, like stone, will reflect most of it. Waves can also bounce back and to in a space, amplifying as they overlap, causing a resonating effect. Or the reflective surfaces may only absorb parts of the audio spectrum, muting the high frequencies, for example. All of these reflections and interactions cause a change, not just in the sound, but in the emotional impact it has on us. As I'll talk about later, I've experienced this visceral change a venue can have on a piece when I heard one of my own pieces performed in two very different acoustics on successive nights, an experience which really gave me an understanding of the part the venue plays in the success or otherwise of a piece. Hope Bagenal, who designed the concert hall in the festival hall behind me, had a question that he'd like to ask to help people understand the importance of acoustics to music. Why do people like singing in the bathroom? And the answer is simple. You're in a room with no carpet, tiles on the walls, so the sound reverberates. It carries on after you've finished singing. And it may also resonate, amplifying certain parts of the sound as the reverberations interact. So what might have sounded weak now becomes warm, rich, and impressive. It changes the emotional quality of the sound. But as we'll see, it's not always quite as straightforward as that. Musical acoustics is a complex science, which, even with all of today's technology, seems to be something that goes wrong just as often as it goes right. To get a sense of how complex reverberations can be, as well as how we probably shouldn't feel too high and mighty about our own technical prowess compared to the past, have a listen to this echo from the Kukulkan temple in Mexico. That strange echo is caused by the height and spacing of the pyramid's steps, which creates an effect like an acoustic filter, emphasising some sound frequencies and suppressing others. But what's shocking to learn is that the echo here closely resembles the call of the quetzal, the beautiful bird found in the region and a venerated messenger of the Mayan gods. Did the Mayans deliberately design their temple to create this acoustic effect? It seems a pretty amazing coincidence, if not. And some concert halls end up with similarly weird acoustic echoes all of their own, although in this case it's definitely unintentional. When the Albert Hall in London, for example, was opened in 1871 by the Prince of Wales, the Times reported, "The address was slowly and distinctly read by His Royal Highness, but the reading was somewhat marred by an echo which seemed to be suddenly awoke from the organ or picture gallery, and repeated the words with a mocking emphasis, which at another time would have been amusing." Part of the problem in the Albert Hall was the domed roof. Curved surfaces are generally one of the most effective ways of amplifying sounds. As this diagram shows, the curve can end up focusing all of the emanating sound waves onto a single point. But in the Albert Hall, the enormous space beneath the dome seems to have resulted in this strange and entirely unexpected echo, which had to be fixed later by adding large circular discs below the dome. So some of these weird anomalies show how complex the world of acoustics is. But on the whole, when we're talking about the effect of a venue on music, we're usually talking about reverberation. We're talking about the amount of time it takes for a sound to decay into silence. So the question is, where does music sound best? Well, the answer of course depends entirely upon what kind of music you're playing. If you're playing outdoors for a wedding ceremony in Senegal, for example, full of dancing and noise, you'll need something loud that carries in that context. Drums like the djembe are loud for a reason. The music is designed with that open and noisy acoustic environment in mind. Similarly, if you were in a band like, say, Talking Heads, you would have started out playing in a venue like the famous CBGB's in New York. Again, a noisy context full of socialising, and a space with a low ceiling filled with furniture, bodies, and almost entirely lacking in reverberation. Again, the music written for such spaces, loud and tightly rhythmic, fits them perfectly. David Byrne from the Talking Heads has written about his views on musical acoustics in this really fascinating new book, How Music Works. I recommend you check it out. At the other end of the spectrum, you have hugely resonant spaces like Gothic cathedrals. Many of these are large, stone-walled spaces and often have a reverberation time of 4 seconds or even longer. And this is where it becomes really interesting to think about the effect a venue has on the composers who are writing for it. What kind of music works well in a place with a 4-second reverb? Well, the first thing is that the harmony would be best served to move nice and slow. Move too fast and the sounds from one chord are going to seep into the next. Things will become muddy and blurry. So if you take an early Western composer like Perotin, who spent his life composing for Notre Dame in Paris, it might be tempting to think that he didn't write music as complex or harmonically advanced as us because he didn't have the chops. But maybe what was actually happening is he was just responding to the venue he was writing for. He was writing music which sounds good in that kind of space. And you could say the same about modern stadium music. Stadiums are usually venues designed with little thought for acoustics, and often they really sound terrible. Plenty of weird echoes, the sound bouncing around all over the place. So what does sound good there? Well, again, nice, simple, clear music, not too much rhythm, harmony that moves nice and slow. Stadium rock. And again, musicians in bands like Coldplay or U2 who know they're going to play in this kind of venue will write this kind of music that sounds good in this kind of environment. Groups like Metallica even seem to have changed style as they start playing in larger venues, slowing their music down, slower grooves, slower chord changes. Compare, for example, the speed and quick chord changes of Jump Into the Fire from 1983 with the slow groove and slow changing harmony of Sad But True 10 years later. You can imagine straight away which one of those would work better in a large stadium. Throughout the centuries, venues seem to have affected music enormously. As David Byrne says, the romantic idea of a composer getting a weird look in his eye and suddenly coming up with a symphony, or the idea of a disillusioned rock singer suddenly expressing his angst in a precisely 3-minute song, are really the exact opposite of what actually happens. Whether consciously or not, most artists are writing with the available venues or outlets for their music in mind, and so as venues change, music changes with it. One of the great masterpieces of Western music, Bach's St. Matthew Passion, might never have happened were it not for a change in architecture. Matthew Passion is a sacred piece. It tells the story of the final period of Jesus' life, but it's far richer in detail, changes of texture, and even variety of tempos from any Passion settings that had come before it. And up till this point, anything sacred like this would have been played in one of those Gothic cathedrals. But the music Bach wrote for the Matthew Passion just wouldn't sound good there, which is kind of ironic because it's probably the most common place you'll hear it today. I heard it myself a while back here in St Albans Cathedral, and you'd be forgiven for thinking, well, it's a religious piece, this must be where it was intended for, so why does it sound so muddy and so mushy? But that's because it wasn't designed for this kind of cathedral space. In the 16th century, the Reformation caused huge changes in religious practice across Europe, changes that were aimed at reducing the unnecessary grandiosity of the Catholic Church and focused fully on bringing the congregation as close as possible to the Word of God. So a Lutheran church like the Thomaskirche in Leipzig, that Bach worked at for the latter part of his life, was smaller and more humble than those grand cathedrals. And most importantly, it had extra galleries where more of the congregation sat, backed by wooden panellings. So people and wood all absorbing sound, so the reverberation in a church like this would have been significantly lower than the cathedrals. Modern acousticians have estimated that the reverb time in the church would have been about 1.5 to 2 seconds, about the same as a modern concert hall. Hope Bagenal said, the reducing of reverberation in Lutheran churches by the inserted galleries, thus enabling string parts to be heard and distinguished, and allowing a brisk tempo, was the most important single factor in the history of music because it led directly to the St. Matthew Passion and the B minor Mass. So that's one time 18th century Germany in the Thomaskirche listening to Bach's St. Matthew Passion. For sure that would have been a time when music sounded at its best. Now, the early classical pieces by Haydn and Mozart would have been written for spaces with even less reverberation than that. The highly furnished rooms in their patrons' palaces, so short reverberation and very clear sound. Over the course of the 19th century, orchestras got larger, and so too did venues. And some of those early classical works can now sound either muddy and confused or distant and thin in these larger, more resonant spaces. So composers adapted and started writing music that worked well in them. The blend of a large mass of instruments sounds great in a place like Carnegie Hall or the Concertgebouw in Amsterdam. And composers started putting more emphasis on delicious textures of sound more than individual contrapuntal lines. And as David Byrne says, they also sometimes employed shock and awe in order to reach the back row that was now further away. Mahler, of course, is a great example of this kind of larger-than-life orchestral writing. So this kind of music works well in these kind of venues. But groove music, music with percussion and drums, struggles in somewhere like Carnegie Hall, as it does in those big stadiums. In fact, I think the problem of getting rhythmically intricate music over to a large audience is a very big challenge. I recently went to see the intricately groovy Wolfpack in the Brixton Academy, which is a modestly large tour venue, but the sound was just mud wherever I stood. Listening to the wrong music played in the wrong venue is where music certainly doesn't sound at its best. And in fact, I was brought face to face with the way the venue affects the music when I followed a group who were doing a short tour of my piece Gumboots. That piece has a slow lyrical first section, followed by 5 tight and rhythmic dances. So on consecutive nights I heard the group perform first in a dry acoustic and then in a resonant room. In the dry acoustic the dances sounded fantastic, tight, precise, groovy. The first part just fell flat. It was like listening from behind a window, watching someone else doing something rather than being part of it yourself. But on the second night, in the resonant spaces, the dances just became a mushy, muddy mess. But the first part became emotional, moving. The sound washed around you and you felt like you were in the presence of something immense reaching up to the heavens. So the same performers, the same piece, but an entirely different response to the music, all because of the properties of the venue. It almost feels sometimes like the only solution would be to write music for a specific venue, write drifting, slow-moving, ethereal music for those reverberant spaces, or write tight, groovy music just for smaller, non-reverberant ones. Or you could actually build your own venue. There's certainly been one composer with enough ego and gumption to pull that off, and that's Wagner. He literally built his own opera house in Bayreuth in the 1870s. The hall has an enlarged orchestral pit to accommodate the big orchestral effects he was after, but it's also hidden from the audience under the stage, partly to create a more direct experience of the drama, but also cleverly muting some of the mid-range of the orchestra. And that mid-range, of course, is exactly where the singers on stage are singing, so it helps them to be heard. So in Wagner's own theatre, listening to the ring cycle would be another place where music sounds at its best, even if for most of us the idea of building our own venue might turn out to be a little extreme. But the key with all of these examples, whether it's Perrotin in Notre Dame Cathedral, the Talking Heads in CBGB's, the St. Matthew Passion in Thomaskirche, or Metallica in a football stadium, is that you're hearing music that's been played in the venue it's designed for. And that's definitely where music will sound best. Just as a little coda, one aspect I haven't touched on yet is the fact that for the past 100 years or so, music has had more than one venue in mind. The venue it will be performed in, but also the venue of our living room or headphones, the venue of recording. And how has this affected the way that we compose music? But that's probably another video, but it's something I've been thinking about in relation to YouTube. So for example, the little Bach arrangement I did felt to me like a piece of music composed specifically with YouTube in mind. And I've been contemplating whether there are more fully composed pieces I might write that are tailored exactly to this medium. It's an intriguing thought, and I hope in the coming months I might be able to offer something along those lines. If you have any thoughts yourself about what a piece written for the venue of YouTube would be, do let me know in the comments. And do also let me know what you think about venues and their impact on music. I'd love to hear more about the kind of places your music has been performed and how that's changed your perception of music. Thanks as ever to my patrons on Patreon, where you can help support the channel for as little as $1 a month. And don't forget to check out my new album of chamber music, The North Wind Was a Woman, which you can stream or download or buy, whatever you prefer. If you enjoyed the video, do like and subscribe and share with your friends, and I'll see you next time.